Story 1. Bananas Behind Bars. The curious case of fruit smuggling in the 1930s. You probably don't think of bananas as contraband. You pick them up in grocery stores, find them in lunchboxes, and see them piled on kitchen counters, a fruit so ordinary it barely registers. But in the 1930s, for certain communities across the United States, bananas weren't just food. They were property. They were status symbols. And in one strange slice of history, they became the centerpiece of an unlikely smuggling case that entangled dock workers, grocers, and organized crime. The roots of the banana smuggling trade can be traced back to a much bigger story: America's uneasy relationship with imported goods during the years of economic depression. The Great Depression wasn't just about lost jobs and empty pockets. It reshaped what people considered valuable. Imported goods, especially perishable ones, took on a kind of exotic aura. To own them, or even to taste them, meant you were living above the fray of ration books and soup lines. Bananas, bright yellow, sweet and fragile, fit perfectly into that cultural space. Dockworkers along the Gulf Coast knew this better than anyone. Shipments of fruit arrived weekly from Central America, unloading at ports in New Orleans, Mobile, and Galveston. Officially, they were destined for major wholesalers who distributed them across the country. Unofficially, some of those bananas never made it onto the trucks. They disappeared into side alleys, warehouses, and eventually into small towns that rarely saw imported fruit. It sounds almost comical, people hiding bunches of bananas under coats or sneaking them out in crates marked fish. But the trade was serious enough that federal investigators began treating it as organized crime. Part of the tension came from the fruit companies themselves. The United Fruit Company, sometimes called El Pulpo or the Octopus because of its grip on Central American politics, guarded its shipments fiercely. They employed private security, pressed charges against dockworkers, and lobbied federal authorities to treat stolen bananas not as petty theft but as interstate smuggling. They argued that every stolen bunch didn't just represent fruit but a disruption to an entire supply chain. When profits were slim in the Depression years, even a few crates missing could mean the difference between breaking even and bankruptcy for small distributors. One case in particular stands out: the 1932 arrest of a group of dock workers in New Orleans accused of siphoning off thousands of pounds of bananas over a period of months. The newspapers at the time treated it half as comedy and half as tragedy. Headlines read, "Banana thieves nabbed on the waterfront," and "Fruit turned sour for dock gang." But underneath the jokes lay something more sinister. These men were accused not just of sneaking fruit, but of working hand in hand with organized networks that distributed the contraband far inland. Imagine, for a moment, a train car leaving New Orleans bound for Kansas City. Officially, it's filled with textiles. Unofficially, in a hidden compartment, it carries crates of bananas. By the time it arrives, those bananas are already half ripe, and they're unloaded in back alleys before the train continues on its way. Local grocers buy them at inflated prices, knowing they can sell them to customers who will pay anything for the taste of something rare. What started as a dock worker sneaking home a bunch for his family had, by the early 30s, become a black market trade worth thousands of dollars a week. Authorities took notice. The FBI, still finding its footing in the pre-Hoover era of modern law enforcement, saw the banana racket as an ideal test case for tackling organized crime outside of Prohibition-era liquor. They launched surveillance operations on the docks, intercepted telegrams, and even planted undercover agents posing as freight clerks. One report noted that bananas had become the new bootleg whiskey, a strange comparison that nonetheless made sense in a decade obsessed with contraband. The investigation revealed unexpected connections. Some of the bananas, it turned out, were being sold to speakeasies. Bananas, when overripe, were a favored ingredient for brewing low-quality alcohol. Others were sold directly to households through word-of-mouth networks, the same way people once whispered about buying sugar during shortages. The crime wasn't violent, but it was disruptive, and it revealed the strange ways ordinary commodities could transform into coveted prizes under the right circumstances. In the New Orleans case, prosecutors faced a challenge: how to convince a jury that stealing bananas was a crime worth punishing with prison sentences. Defense attorneys leaned hard on comedy. "Gentlemen," one lawyer said, "my clients are not gangsters. They are merely hungry men who took a bit of fruit." The courtroom reportedly erupted in laughter, but the prosecutors pressed on, presenting evidence of coded ledgers, bribed freight inspectors, and bank deposits that didn't match wages. This wasn't petty theft, they argued. It was organized. The trial drew spectators who filled the courtroom to see what many called the banana men. Some came for amusement. Others came because they had been touched by the trade themselves. One grocer testified that he bought bananas under the table not because he wanted to, but because his customers demanded them. "You don't understand," he told the court. "People came in begging for them. They'd pay in advance. If I didn't get them bananas, they'd go to the next store." It's easy, from today's perspective, to dismiss the case as absurd. Bananas are everywhere, after all. But in the context of the 1930s, when scarcity defined everyday life, the case symbolized something larger. It showed how easily everyday goods could become currency. It showed how desire and desperation created markets where none were meant to exist. And it left investigators with a deeper question, one that went far beyond fruit. If bananas could be contraband, what else was slipping through the cracks of Depression-era America? The first courtroom trial for the New Orleans banana smuggling ring was supposed to be a simple case of theft. At least, that's what the prosecutors had in mind. But as the proceedings stretched into their second week, it became clear that what they had stumbled into wasn't just an isolated act of dockside pilfering. It was a decentralized network. A quiet, banana-scented web of economic rebellion stretching from the humid waterfronts of Louisiana to the dry interior of the Midwest. What made this case so difficult to contain was its very nature: non-violent, familiar, and strangely human. These weren't hardened criminals with weapons and getaway cars. These were warehouse clerks, produce distributors, railroad porters, people who wore work boots, not fedoras. Their smuggling didn't look like smuggling. It looked like extra crates stacked a little too high, like misprinted manifests, like bananas that just didn't arrive at their scheduled destination. The rise of the banana middleman. In 1931, a U.S. Customs audit flagged a sharp discrepancy between the amount of bananas imported through the port of New Orleans and the quantities reaching regulated grocers across the central states. Thousands of pounds were going unaccounted for monthly. It wasn't the sheer volume that set off alarms, it was the pattern. Some crates arrived entirely empty. Others were marked for spoilage disposal, but had never been documented at a disposal site. The truth emerged through whispered testimony and unsigned letters. Entire shipments were being intercepted by freelance middlemen, often former dockworkers or unemployed truckers. These men and they were almost exclusively men operated in what was dubbed the banana loop. Their job was to catch the fruit before it officially entered the warehouse system. Once intercepted, the bananas were loaded onto unmarked trucks, driven at night to rural drop points, and sold to independent grocers in places like Monroe, Louisiana, and Vicksburg, Mississippi. These middlemen rarely kept ledgers. Payments were often in cash, sometimes in barter. There were stories of bananas traded for gasoline, for tires, even for medicine. The bananas moved fast, too fast to track, and they ripened just as quickly, making the trade unusually urgent. A stolen television might sit in a pawn shop for weeks. Stolen bananas had to be gone in hours. And yet the FBI kept coming up empty-handed. No warehouses were found stockpiling crates. No big-money kingpins were pulling strings. Instead, the ring seemed to run itself like a living organism. Someone would make a call to a known contact at the docks. A crate would fall off the ledger. A driver would show up that night, slip $5 to a watchman, and the goods would disappear. What perplexed agents most wasn't just how widespread the smuggling had become, it was how culturally accepted it was. In towns ravaged by economic collapse, nobody called the police when a fruit shipment arrived by unmarked truck. People were grateful. They saw the bananas not as stolen goods, but as little yellow miracles in a world made gray by dust and debt. The banana women. There's one part of this story that rarely appears in the reports: the women who made the smuggling ring viable. While the men moved the product, it was often women who sold it: housewives, corner grocers' daughters, or market stall owners who had built quiet customer bases for years. These women, in dozens of small southern towns, played a critical role in creating demand. One such woman, known in court documents only as Miss H, ran a market stall in Alexandria, Louisiana. She became a key witness not for the prosecution but for the defense. Her testimony revealed that she had been receiving special shipments every other Tuesday for almost a year, which she sold exclusively to pregnant women and older citizens. "It was medicine to some of them," she said in court, her voice steady. "You tell me that's a crime, and I'll take the stand again." The jury was stunned, and the newspapers ate it up. One headline in the Times-Picayune read, "Bananas for the people, not the profiteers." Suddenly, the narrative was changing. The government was prosecuting men for stealing bananas, but the country was seeing mothers feeding fruit to malnourished children. The FBI's carefully built case began to lose its moral high ground. The freight train that shouldn't have stopped. Still, there were elements of the ring that pointed to real criminal organization. The turning point came in late 1932 when a train car bound for Memphis made an unscheduled stop near Yazoo City, Mississippi. The conductor, later identified as having ties to a New Orleans warehouse, claimed there was an engine issue. But local police noticed something odd by the time the train restarted. One of the rear cars was empty. When investigators searched the area, they found banana peels littering a dirt road leading into a private farm. A barn nearby held crates labeled floor tiles, though none actually contained flooring. A pattern emerged: falsified cargo labels, timed stops, and rapid rural distribution. Whoever was orchestrating the operation was doing so with an eye for logistics. This wasn't just opportunity theft, it was planned. Authorities detained the conductor and began pressing for names. What emerged was a strange alliance: part-time laborers, railroad staff, even a former fruit inspector who had overlooked certain discrepancies for months in exchange for monthly envelopes of cash. And yet, there was still no mastermind. The operation had no head, only hands. A crime of circumstance. It became clearer with every new testimony that this wasn't a mafia-style operation with central leadership. It was a swarm, a collection of individuals who, out of necessity, had created an invisible market. Bananas were just the vehicle. The real currency was trust. One of the FBI agents, in a private memo, wrote, "This investigation is unlike our prior cases. No threats, no murders, no extortion, no centralized direction. It's as if the desperation of the times has grown its own organism. I don't think they see it as crime at all." In a different era, the banana smuggling ring might have been crushed quickly. But this was the Depression. The country was hungry not just for food, but for dignity, for agency, for something that made life feel less like a waiting room. The federal government pushed forward with additional charges, including tax evasion, customs fraud, and illegal interstate trade. But each case was harder to prove. No one kept receipts. No one testified against their neighbors. And more importantly, the public was losing interest. To many, it wasn't a scandal. It was survival. The legacy of the bananas. By 1934, the smuggling ring had largely dissolved, not through enforcement but through circumstance. As the economy began to recover, the margins for selling black market fruit disappeared. Grocery stores began receiving regular imports, prices stabilized, and the urgency that fueled the trade faded. But something remained: a quiet myth, a local legend. whispered in dock bars and grocery basements. In some parts of the South, older residents would point to a certain kind of banana slightly smaller, slightly sweeter and say, "Those are the good ones, like we used to get during the trade." There were rumors, too, of private plantations in Central America that marked crates for the loot, meant specifically for the smuggling network, of buyers who still kept secret contacts at the ports long after the demand had ended. And perhaps most curious of all, a small storage facility just outside of Mobile, Alabama, which was raided in 1935. Authorities found 63 crates of bananas, each slightly fermented, and 14 barrels of high-proof alcohol made entirely from banana mash. The man arrested, who claimed he had no idea it was illegal, said he was just continuing the tradition. But by then, it was too late to revive it. The press had moved on, the court records were sealed, and the country had new enemies to fear: bank robbers, union strikes, and the looming shadow of war. And yet, for a brief few years, one of the country's most sought-after black market goods wasn't gold, or liquor, or tobacco. It was bananas. When the banana trade went quiet. By early 1935, the smuggling of bananas, once a humming, fast-moving shadow economy, began to vanish from the headlines. The last major case brought to court involved 3 men from Baton Rouge who had allegedly bribed a warehouse inspector to mark nearly 200 crates of bananas as lost cargo. By the time the trial opened, however, 2 of the men had disappeared, and the third refused to speak. The charges were quietly dropped due to lack of evidence. The bananas had, quite literally, rotted in custody. This fatting out of legal proceedings marked the official end of federal interest in the fruit smuggling trade. But for the communities involved and the quiet beneficiaries of the loot, the ending felt more like a sunset than a shutdown. Behind the scenes, some of the banana runners transitioned into legitimate roles in produce distribution. A handful of small, now-defunct companies in southern Arkansas and western Alabama were rumored to have been founded by former loop drivers, men who used the proceeds of smuggling to buy used trucks and set up routes legally once restrictions eased. One such driver, Charlie Delmont, later told a local radio station in the 1950s, "I reckon I moved 10 tons of bananas in 1933 alone. No guns, no trouble, just people wanting something sweet in a bad time. When it was over, I started my own route. Folks already knew me." Charlie would eventually retire in his 70s, and his produce company would quietly shutter without a single mention of its origin. He was just one of many living reminders that what was once a federal offense could, in a different season, become a family business. The ripple effect on law enforcement. For the FBI, the banana smuggling investigations offered a unique lesson. They had cut their teeth on prohibition, a decade of chasing armed bootleggers and blood-stained speakeasies. In contrast, the banana trade was an odd, almost gentle crime. No one was murdered. No one was kidnapped. It was theft, yes, but it was theft with the soft edges of social necessity. It tested the Bureau's ability to investigate non-violent but widespread conspiracies and to interpret economic desperation as motive. One internal report from 1935 reads, "In contrast to liquor enforcement, these actors are more embedded, less flamboyant, and driven by community allegiance rather than personal gain. Standard enforcement methods are insufficient." It was one of the first federal acknowledgments that crime could evolve alongside economics, and that ordinary people could become accomplices when the system around them failed. That report would go on to inform later approaches to ration fraud during World War II and black market gasoline coupon rings in the 1940s. The cultural memory of a fruit. Despite its quiet exit from law enforcement priorities, the banana trade lingered in American culture in subtle ways. In the 1941 crime drama City Port Shadows, a dockworker named Benny hides crates of fruit to feed his family, only to be caught by a company man and jailed. Though the film never mentions bananas directly, the connection was obvious to audiences familiar with the scandal. Small-town gossip would occasionally resurface with new twists on the old story. A preacher who kept a box of bananas in the pulpit, claiming they were gifts from above, but allegedly delivered by a loot truck. A wedding in Vicksburg in which guests were served banana pudding during the height of the Depression, raising eyebrows about the bride's family connections. A high school principal in Monroe who suspended 2 students for selling bananas on campus without a license in 1934. The boys reportedly got the fruit from an uncle downriver. Some families even passed down recipes specific to the smuggled fruit, claiming it had a different flavor or that it ripened faster than the ones from stores. Whether true or not, the idea stuck. Smuggled bananas became a symbol not of crime, but of survival. A quiet deal and the corporate disinterest. By the time the United Fruit Company formally closed its security complaints against the Port of New Orleans in 1936, the company had already shifted focus. Their attention was now on Central American labor issues and political instability, not stolen produce in Depression-era America. Privately, some historians believe the company struck a quiet deal with U.S. customs officials. As long as losses remained under a certain threshold, enforcement would not be prioritized. The assumption was that cracking down hard on the banana trade would cost more in labor relations and public perception than it would recover in lost crates. From a business perspective, it was a calculated retreat. From a historical one, it was the moment a company quietly acknowledged the futility of fighting against economic despair. When crime lives in memory, what makes the banana smuggling story so unusual isn't just the absurdity of it, though. Of course, the idea of federal agents chasing after tropical fruit does carry a certain comedy. What makes it compelling is how deeply it reflects the shape of human behavior during crisis. When people are hungry for food, for meaning, for control, they improvise. They find cracks in the system. They redefine right and wrong by the weight of need. The banana trade didn't create criminals in the traditional sense. It revealed how quickly ordinary people can become extraordinary when the rules no longer make sense. And in the end, it asked a quiet question not just of those who stole the fruit, but of the society that made the theft necessary. When survival becomes a crime, who gets to decide what justice looks like? Story 2. The Man Who Forged Town, the check fraud king of Nebraska. You're probably used to crime being tied to a location A bank in one town, a stolen car in another. But what happens when the crime is the town? When a place only seems real because someone forged its existence street by street, business by business on paper. That's what happened in 1948, when a man calling himself Harold Brost began writing checks from a bank that didn't exist, based in a town that had no people, no roads, no buildings. Just a name, Winchester, Nebraska. If you flipped open an atlas in those days, you wouldn't find Winchester anywhere near the Platte River or along the sandhills. But dozens of businesses across the Midwest accepted checks drawn from its first agricultural bank. Grocers, car dealers, even local municipalities fell for it. And by the time anyone questioned it, Harold Brost had already disappeared. This wasn't a story about high-speed getaways or gangland killings. It was the slow, quiet unraveling of a fantasy, one born from stationery, rubber stamps, and the peculiar belief that paperwork could build a reality. The man with the perfect signature. No one knows exactly where Harold Brost came from. When he appeared in Omaha in January of 1948, he was already calling himself the acting mayor of Winchester. He wore suits that were too nice for a man his age, maybe late 30s, maybe early 40s, and he spoke with the smooth certainty of someone who had been believed too often. He first showed up in person at the Midwestern Equipment Expo, a regional fair where farming machinery vendors pitched the latest in post-war agricultural tech. Brost claimed he was there to buy on behalf of the Winchester Agricultural Cooperative, a group of 63 members building a new town between Kearney and Kazet. Vendors welcomed him with open arms. The war was over. The government had been paying subsidies to rural communities. Entire towns had sprung up in Nebraska overnight in the past decade, why not one more? He placed modest orders: a pair of tractors, fencing materials, irrigation pipes, always paid with checks from the First Agricultural Bank of Winchester. He wrote them casually, with a confident hand and a flourish beneath the name. None bounced at first. Within weeks, Brost was placing larger orders. A dealership in Grand Island sold him a used Studebaker truck. A printing press in Des Moines agreed to produce 5,000 brochures advertising land opportunities in Winchester, the next jewel of the plains. They even helped design a logo, a golden stalk of wheat over a rising sun. Nobody asked to see the town. After all, who questions a bank check with a town name stamped in official ink? The illusion deepens. By the time spring arrived, Winchester was beginning to seem real, at least on paper. Brost hired a small PR firm to write copy for land sales brochures. He ran radio ads on local stations. Tired of the city, come home to Winchester. He filed business listings with regional directories. He applied for and received a post office box in Lincoln under the town's name. He even hired a retired architect to sketch out a proposed layout of the downtown core. The plans showed a school, 2 churches, and a bank. Of course, a bank. The architect, when later interviewed, said he had no reason to doubt the assignment. He received a cashier's check for $150 up front and another $300 upon delivery of the sketches. He said Brost spoke with the certainty of someone who had already bought the land and was just waiting for zoning approval. But there was no zoning board. There was no land. There was no Winchester. What Brost had done and what made him so difficult to stop was create a web of legitimacy strong enough to carry weight in transactions. Each piece reinforced the next. The brochure referenced the architect. The bank referenced the town. The town referenced the agriculture cooperative. And the cooperative, it was just Harold Brost. A small-town sheriff gets curious. The entire illusion might have continued longer if not for a skeptical sheriff in Dawson County named Leland Richter. He received a letter from a seed supplier who had sold Brost 40 pounds of corn and wanted to confirm delivery. The supplier couldn't find Winchester on a map. Sheriff Richter drove out himself, scanning back roads and surveying the land where Winchester was allegedly being developed. He found pasture land, wind-blown and empty, with no structures, not even survey flags. He returned to his office and sent a formal inquiry to the Nebraska State Banking Commission. The response came in a week later. There was no First Agricultural Bank of Winchester registered with the state. That's when the wheels began turning. The chase begins. By the time a formal investigation launched, Brost had already vanished from Omaha. His hotel room was empty. The bills were paid. The only thing left behind was a notepad with the Winchester Bank logo and the phrase, "Committee for Future Growth meeting on Friday." There was no committee. There was no meeting. But there was a trail, one made of endorsements, invoices, and letters. Investigators traced checks written to over 30 vendors across 4 states. All had been cashed or deposited before being flagged as fraudulent. What puzzled authorities most was how few of the checks had bounced immediately. Some cleared because banks assumed small-town banking delays. Others were paid through redirected funds from other fraudulent checks, a kind of short-lived Ponzi structure that kept Brost afloat for just long enough. In total, they estimated he had extracted nearly $45,000 worth of goods and services, over $500,000 in today's currency. And he had done it without a weapon, without a partner, and without ever raising his voice. The unanswered question: Despite dozens of interviews and a growing paper trail, Harold Brost was never captured. The last confirmed sighting came from a waitress in Council Bluffs, Iowa, who claimed he tipped her with a crisp $10 bill and left behind a business card reading Winchester Agricultural Futures. The address on the card, a demolished lot. No fingerprints, no social security number, no known relatives. Investigators later speculated that Harold Brost may have been an alias layered atop several others. Some believe he fled north, perhaps to Canada. Others claim he died in obscurity. But every few years, a check surfaces an old document pulled from a dusty file cabinet bearing the First Agricultural Bank of Winchester seal. A reminder of the time a man built an entire town from stationery, confidence, and a practiced hand with a checkbook. The strange part, none of it was real until people started believing in it. The Winchester expansion plan. By mid-1948, while investigators were scrambling to understand the full scope of the fraud, Winchester, Nebraska, had already become something of a whispered legend among small business owners in the Midwest. And for a brief, flickering moment, it felt real because so many people had invested in the idea, whether financially, emotionally, or by sheer willful ignorance. Real estate agents were the next to get drawn in. In late April, 2 brokers in Lincoln reported that a Mr. H. Brost had contacted them separately about subdividing tracts of land, recently acquired near Lexington, claiming it was the final step before Winchester could apply for a local government charter. What's important here is that Brost hadn't just sold a fake story, he had somehow convinced people to participate in building it. One of the agents, E. Turleson, later recalled in a sworn statement. He said the town had families waiting to move in, that there'd be home sites marked by May. I asked why I couldn't find Winchester on a map, and he said with a smile, "That's because we're going to put it on the map." And I believed him. Turleson even began drawing up fake deeds for parcels of land Brost said he owned. At no point did anyone ask to see proof of ownership. You might think that such a con required a web of co-conspirators, but that's what makes Harold Brost so fascinating. He worked almost entirely alone. His power came not from manipulation, but from paperwork and from exploiting one of the most overlooked truths about post-war America. If the documents looked right, people wanted to believe. A nation primed for illusion. The late 1940s were a time of flux. The war was over, and America was bursting with optimism. People were moving westward. Entire suburbs were being built in weeks. The government had pumped millions into the GI Bill, enabling veterans to purchase homes and start small businesses. Land was being bought and sold like candy and often sight unseen. It was, in many ways, the perfect time for someone like Brost to thrive. There were minimal oversight systems between counties. Most records were local and maintained by hand. Real estate and banking were rooted in trust and the assumption of good faith. When Brost told people that Winchester was a project funded through regional co-ops and agricultural bonds, nobody questioned it. That kind of civic boosterism of small towns and shared economic futures was exactly what people wanted to hear. He even began circulating newsletters titled Winchester Weekly, printed on cream-colored paper, featuring fictional resident updates, church announcements, and agricultural forecasts. These were mailed to vendors he'd worked with, land speculators, and even a few local officials in the Nebraska State Development Office. One of the newsletters read, "We are pleased to announce the arrival of our third family, the McDowells, who will be assisting with fencing and livestock. Young Timmy McDowell has already claimed a hilltop as his exploring station." Of course, there were no McDowells. There was no Timmy, but with each mailing, the fiction deepened. The more people heard about Winchester, the less they questioned it. And more importantly, the more likely they were to accept one of Brost's checks. The breaking point, when fantasy meets investigation. The break in the case came not from a check bouncing, but from a quiet, almost accidental observation made by a young woman named Helen Womack. Helen was a typist working for the Nebraska Secretary of State's office. Her job was mundane: transcribe requests, file corporate registrations, and sort correspondence. But she was meticulous, and one day she noticed something odd. She had processed 2 letters from different businesses asking to confirm Winchester's charter status. One mentioned Brost's name, the other referred to the Winchester Utilities Board. Helen checked the municipal records, nothing. Then she checked with the county clerk's offices in Dawson, Buffalo, and Lincoln counties. Still nothing. She flagged the letters to her supervisor, who in turn sent an official query to the state attorney general's office. That's when everything unraveled. Within weeks, the attorney general's office had launched a formal investigation. They requested records from every registered bank in Nebraska and confirmed that First Agricultural Bank of Winchester didn't exist. Warrants were issued, but by then Brost was gone again. This time he left behind more than just stationery. Investigators found a storage unit in Omaha containing hundreds of blank checks, a Heidelberg letterpress machine, 3 different typewriters, and pre-printed envelopes bearing return addresses from a dozen fake Winchester offices. Winchester School Board, Winchester Public Works, Winchester Parks Initiative, and more. It was a town made entirely from paper. The vendor collapsed in the fallout. The effects rippled outward. Small business owners across 4 states, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota, began reporting their own encounters with Harold Brost, or versions of him. Some claimed he used aliases like Henry Brossard or H.B. Wenslow. Others described him with a mustache, others clean-shaven. His appearance was as fluid as his story. Dozens of businesses had to eat the cost. One farm machinery company in Topeka nearly collapsed after realizing $12,000 in equipment had been traded for worthless paper. An especially painful loss was felt by the McLaren family, who ran a modest hardware store in Kearney. They'd sold Brost over $3,000 worth of goods, including fencing tools, seeds, and lumber. After the checks bounced, they had to lay off 2 employees. Mrs. McLaren later said in an interview, "I just couldn't believe it. He was so polite. Said he was going to name a street after our shop. Said he'd bring us a pie when the store in Winchester opened. I even wrote down the street name, McLaren Drive. We laughed about it. They kept the sign he mailed them. A crime with no victim, and yet." The difficulty in prosecuting Brost beyond his vanishing act was the absence of classic criminal markers. No one had been hurt. No one had been directly threatened. The checks weren't forged against real accounts. They were fabrications, creative fictions presented as financial instruments. It was fraud, yes, but it wasn't violent. And in post-war America, federal law enforcement was far more concerned with communist infiltration and interstate kidnapping than imaginative check kiting. In the end, the FBI turned over the investigation to state authorities, who kept it open until 1952 before closing it, pending further information. No one was ever arrested. No charges were filed. Brost, if that was even his name, simply vanished. And then Winchester returns. The final, strangest twist in the story came in 1961. A man in Hastings, Nebraska, filed paperwork to incorporate a new agricultural co-op. His application referenced a dissolved organization called the Winchester Agricultural Collective. Investigators were stunned. Had Brost resurfaced? They tracked the man down. He was 28, a recent college graduate, and claimed he'd found the name Winchester Co-op in an old box of stationery at an estate sale. He thought it sounded strong and decided to revive the idea for his own business. When asked if he knew the history behind the name, he simply shook his head and said, "I thought Winchester was a real town." fiction that touched reality. By the early 1950s, the name Winchester, Nebraska, had become something of a ghost in the state's bureaucratic machine. It existed only in outdated business ledgers, yellowing stationery, bounced checks, and the memories of those who once dealt with the man who said he was building a town. But even though the legal investigations had fizzled out, Winchester's strange legacy lingered. In Kearney, there was a brief period where kids played a game called Mayor of Winchester. The rules were simple. One kid got to be Harold Brost, and the others tried to build the town with paper, pens, and stamps. The winner was whoever could convince the most adults to sign fake documents. No one taught them this game. They picked it up from overheard conversations from parents who'd been conned, from news clippings, from myth. And perhaps that's the strangest part of it all. Winchester, Nebraska never existed, and yet, in some small ways, it did. Not because Brost built it, but because others believed in it, even if only briefly, even if only on paper. Paper towns and phantom settlements. What Harold Brost created wasn't entirely unique in concept. The American frontier is full of stories about paper towns, settlements drawn up on maps by land speculators hopping to sell lots in places that never developed. But Brost didn't just draw a town. He ran it. He wrote its history in real time, sent out press releases, hired an architect, created a newspaper, staffed fictional committees, and circulated city council minutes no one else attended. He even had residents whose names he invented. What separated him from 19th century land scammers was precision. Most con men of the era aimed to make a quick buck and run. Brost played the long game. He forged trust before he forged documents. He blended civic optimism with carefully constructed lies, a powerful formula in a nation still healing from war and hungry for new beginnings. The psychology of belief. Why did so many smart, cautious business people fall for Winchester? The answer lies in what psychologists now call authority bias. People trust confidence. They trust paperwork that looks official. They trust repeated language that signals legitimacy. Charter, cooperative, regional planning committee, public works grant. Brost used the right words. He wore the right clothes. He sent the right follow-ups. And in the 1940s, when systems were paper-heavy and records were decentralized, it wasn't hard to string together enough artifacts to support an illusion. He exploited something deeper too, the uniquely American idea that progress is possible anywhere. That a man could show up with a dream, put it on paper, and with a little luck and gumption turn it into a thriving town. Winchester tapped into that idea. It gave people something to root for, even if it was a fraud. The unresolved trail. While no one ever found Brost again, pieces of his story continued to resurface for decades. In 1967, a retired bank manager from Wichita claimed that in 1955, a man matching Brost's description tried to open a business line of credit under the name Harrison W. Brandt, referencing Winchester Seed and Supply. The application was denied, but the man vanished before authorities could be notified. In 1973, a box of Winchester Public Utility stationery was discovered in an antique shop in Tulsa. It contained 13 blank checks, a dated radio script from 1949, and a leather-bound city planning journal containing hand-drawn layouts of proposed sewer lines, complete with fictitious names for city engineers. And perhaps most compelling, a 1980 newspaper column from an elderly farmer in York, Nebraska, who wrote, "They say Harold Brost vanished. I don't think he did. I think he became someone else. Maybe he kept building towns in his head. Maybe he moved east and sold them there. Maybe somewhere a town exists that he dreamed up and this time it stuck." There is, to this day, no known photograph of Brost, no confirmed birth certificate, no grave, only a signature and the echoes of a town no one ever visited. Reflections on a harmless con. Was it harmless? That's the question most people ask when they first hear about Winchester. After all, no one was killed. No one was robbed at gunpoint. No banks collapsed. Some businesses lost money, yes. Others, reputational damage. But there was something almost whimsical about the deception, something storybook. But con artists, even the quiet ones, always leave damage in their wake. Some vendors lost entire seasons of income. One couple who sold farming equipment to Brost in Iowa lost their home when the bank recalled their loan after checks bounced. Another small-town newspaper had to lay off a typesetter after printing Winchester brochures they were never paid for. Harold Brost didn't need violence. His weapon was belief. And belief, once betrayed, doesn't heal easily. The town that taught a lesson. Today, if you drive between Lexington and Cozad, you'll pass through fields that look like any others. Nothing unusual, no marker, no plaque, no ruins of a dream. But if you stop in the right diner in Kearney or Grand Island and ask the right old-timer about Winchester, you might get a story. They'll lean in, lower their voice and say, "That was the town that never was, but for a little while everyone thought it could be." And maybe that's the lesson behind the forgery. The greatest con men don't steal with threats. They steal with hope. They give people something just real enough to believe in and just fake enough to disappear before the truth catches up. Story 3. Murder on credit. When store accounts led to death in small-town America. You probably wouldn't think a line of credit at the local general store could end in bloodshed. After all, in small-town America, store credit was more than a financial arrangement. It was a gesture of trust, a handshake, a way to bridge the gap between harvests, between paychecks, between hard winters and hopeful springs. But in 1926, in the quiet Kansas town of Hollow Creek, population just under 400, that very trust was the motive for murder. And the resulting case would leave investigators baffled, residents divided, and an entire region questioning whether a man's good name was worth killing for. This wasn't a big city crime. There were no gangsters, no bank robberies, just a single unpaid account, a missing payment, and a man found dead behind the butcher shop, face down in a rain barrel. The crime that broke the quiet. It was a Wednesday morning in late March when Walter Dixon, Hollow Creek's butcher and town councilman, opened his back door to find the barrel half full with water, and with something far worse. The dead man, later identified as 52-year-old Harold Kinnick, had been seen just the day before arguing with store owner Earl Penny Driscoll over a mounting line of unpaid credit. Kinnick owed $47.38. In today's money, that's around $800. Not a fortune, but more than a farmer with a bad harvest could easily spare in early spring. Driscoll, by all accounts, was a fair but firm businessman. He let neighbors run tabs but expected payment by the end of each season. Kinnick's account had rolled over twice, and the rumor in town was that Driscoll was done waiting. The night before the murder, multiple witnesses saw the two men in a heated exchange outside the store. Voices were raised. Driscoll's assistant, a 17-year-old boy named Albert "Albie" Morse, said he heard Driscoll shout, "You can't eat on promises, Harold." That was the last time Kinnick was seen alive. Who was Harold Kinnick? Harold wasn't a troublemaker. He was a tenant farmer renting 30 acres from a retired school teacher and trying, like most of the town, to get by. He had a wife, Mabel, and 2 young daughters. His reputation was one of quiet decency, but also quiet desperation. The last few seasons had been brutal. Hailstorms, drought, late frosts. Neighbors said Harold had taken to paying with delay, promising payment tomorrow or next week, or once I get the milk check from the co-op. But delays weren't currency, and in Hollow Creek, where everyone knew each other's business, word spread fast when someone couldn't pay. Mabel Kinnick later told police her husband had been nervous that week. Not about Driscoll's threats, but but about the growing whispers that he was living off borrowed food and goodwill. He said he felt like people looked at him like a thief, she told investigators. Like he was stealing every time he took a can of beans off a shelf. The forensics of 1926. The coroner's report was blunt force trauma to the head, followed by drowning. Kinnick had been struck likely with a heavy object, then submerged in the barrel post-mortem. No defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. That detail alone stunned the sheriff. If there had been no struggle, it suggested one of two things. Kinnick had been caught completely unaware, or he knew and trusted his killer. Sheriff Emil Roberts was 62 years old, nearing retirement, and not accustomed to murder investigations. Hollow Creek hadn't seen a violent death in 17 years, but he took the case personally. He knew both Kinnick and Driscoll had bought sausage from one and canned peaches from the other. Roberts' first stop was the general store. He found Driscoll calmly stocking shelves. When asked about the argument, Driscoll admitted to the confrontation but denied any knowledge of Kinnick's whereabouts. "I said my piece," he told the sheriff, "but I didn't lay a hand on him. I sent him on his way like always." But what came next would turn suspicion into near certainty. Roberts asked to see the credit ledger. Kinnick's name had been erased. Not crossed out, not marked paid, fully erased. The indentation was still visible under lamplight, and a faint $47.38 could be read by tilting the page at an angle. Why would Driscoll erase the debt, unless he believed the debtor would no longer need to pay? Driscoll claimed the erasure was a mistake. He said Albie, the teenage assistant, had dropped a bottle of ink on the ledger the day before and had tried to clean it with rubbing alcohol. But Albie, when asked, said he hadn't even handled the book that week. The contradiction was enough to arrest Driscoll for questioning. The town divides. Driscoll's arrest sent ripples through Hollow Creek. To some, he was a murderer. To others, a scapegoat. Church leaders defended him. They said Driscoll was a pillar of the town, known for donating food to the poor and funding repairs to the chapel's roof. Others, especially those who had owed him money, described him as a man who remembered every nickel and never forgot a debt, even if he forgave it. More troubling was the divide along class lines. Kinnick was poor, his farm faltering. Driscoll was modestly wealthy by Hollow Creek standards. He owned the general store, had a car, and sat on the school board. Whispers of favoritism began circulating. That Driscoll would walk free while Kinnick's family buried a husband and father with no answers and no justice. But the sheriff wasn't finished digging. A second clue soon emerged, one that would complicate the case and muddy the waters. The letter in the tin can. A group of schoolchildren playing near the edge of Kinnick's farm found something strange beneath the porch of an abandoned shed. A tin can, wrapped in cloth, sealed with wax. Inside was a single, folded note in Kinnick's handwriting. It read, "If anything happens to me, look to the man I owe the most. I fear he would rather see a debt buried than settled." The note was unsigned, undated, and unaddressed, but it was unmistakably Kinnick's script. Was it a premonition, a warning, a planted piece of misdirection? Mabel confirmed the handwriting but said she'd never seen the note before. "Harold never kept secrets from me," she said. But the sheriff wasn't so sure. The timing, the tone, it felt too perfect, almost too dramatic for the humble man he'd known. And it raised a deeper question. If Kinnick feared for his life, why not go to the sheriff directly? Why hide a letter in a tin can beneath a shed? Unless he wanted to create a story. Unless he wasn't just the victim, but also part of the plot. The letter that tipped the town. The discovery of the letter in the tin can change everything. What had started as a straightforward, if tragic, suspicion of murder over unpaid credit now raised new questions. Sheriff Emil Roberts, already under pressure from county officials and a rapidly gossiping town, had to ask himself a question no small-town lawman ever wants to face. What if the man in the rain barrel planned his own death to frame someone else? It sounded ridiculous at first, but the letter's language was just vague enough to inspire doubt and just specific enough to imply motive. No names were mentioned, only the man I owe the most. That could have been Driscoll, yes, but it could also have been someone else entirely. Could it have been a setup? Or, and this was even darker, could someone else have planted the letter after Kinnick's death to make it look like he'd left a warning? Either way, the investigation was no longer simple. Sheriff Roberts doubled back to the credit ledger, this time bringing in a handwriting analyst from Topeka. The erasure of Kinnick's name was now more than suspicious. It was potentially part of a deliberate cover-up or a botched attempt to obscure a motive. The analyst confirmed two things. The name had been erased with more than alcohol. It had been scraped, gently, with a knife or razor. The handwriting on the rest of the page was consistent, except for one entry, a payment logged under Vol.9 $9.50. That one entry was written by a different hand. Rowe, better known as Lenora Rowe, was not a farmer, but a seamstress and friend of Mabel Kinnick. The Rowe connection. Lenora Rowe was quiet, unmarried, and lived alone with her elderly mother. She had a reputation in town as a respectable though somewhat private woman. She'd taken in the occasional sewing job from the general store, but had never been known to keep a ledger or take part in town politics. Sheriff Roberts visited her home under the guise of returning a church donation form. Lenora welcomed him in and offered tea. When asked about the ledger entry, she stiffened. "I paid Penny for materials," she said quickly. "Thread, cotton, buttons. It was a one-time thing." But Roberts noticed something strange. Her hands, ink-stained, calloused, and bearing the slight trace of graphite dust. "You keep a ledger of your own?" he asked casually. "Of course, for my customers." "Mind if I see it?" She hesitated, just long enough to be suspicious, then brought out a small notebook wrapped in twine. The handwriting matched the altered entry in Driscoll's ledger. When pressed, Lenora admitted something that reframed the entire investigation. "I helped Penny fix the book," she said. "After Harold died, he was worried it would make him look like a cold man charging the dead." She claimed it was a gesture of respect, not deception, but Roberts wasn't buying it. Especially when, 2 days later, the store's assistant, young Albie Morse, changed his story. The boy cracks. Albie had been the most neutral character in the story so far, a kid with no stake in Hollow Creek's adult tensions. But when his father, a factory worker in nearby Salina, came home drunk one night and accused the boy of getting mixed up in a murder, Albie cracked. He showed up at the sheriff's office the next morning, eyes red, hands trembling. "I lied," he said, "about the ink spill. That didn't happen. Mr. Driscoll told me to say it." According to Albie, the night Harold Kinnick was killed, he and Driscoll had stayed late cleaning the store. Around 7:30 p.m., Kinnick arrived and asked to speak privately. Driscoll told Albie to lock up and go home. But Albie didn't go home. He waited outside, sitting on the curb near the back of the store, smoking a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have, and he heard them arguing louder this time. Then a thud, and silence. When Driscoll came outside 5 minutes later, he looked shaken. He told Albie to go home again, and this time the boy obeyed. The next morning, the barrel behind the butcher shop had its gruesome surprise. The arrest and its complications. With the new testimony, Sheriff Roberts had enough to make a formal arrest. Earl Penny Driscoll was taken into custody and charged with second-degree murder. The town buzzed with equal parts vindication and confusion. Some were relieved. Others, especially members of the church and older business owners, claimed the sheriff had been led astray by boyish nerves. The case seemed solid: motive, opportunity. even a faint confession in the ledger erasure. But then the widow stepped forward. Mabel Kinnick, who had, up until this point, maintained a quiet presence, called a meeting with the sheriff and the county attorney. She brought with her 3 folded letters, each one addressed to her, each in Harold's handwriting, and each more unsettling than the last. They read in part, "I fear I've shamed us beyond repair. My debts have become poison in this town. I feel myself slipping further into thoughts I cannot share. If something happens, I ask only that you forgive the man. He did what he felt was right." Sheriff Roberts sat in silence as Mabel handed them over. "I think my husband wanted to die," she said, "and I think he wanted someone to blame. Was it suicide staged as murder, a confrontation gone wrong, or something stranger, a man sacrificing himself to destroy a man he resented?" And then days later, a twist even the sheriff didn't expect. One final witness. The unexpected witness. The final turn in the investigation came not from court proceedings or legal files, but from a letter, not mailed, not addressed, just quietly handed over by a local priest. Father Alton Bishop had been Hollow Creek's parish leader for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't a man who liked to interfere with criminal matters, but he also wasn't blind to the complexities of his flock. One Sunday, after Mass, he approached Sheriff Emil Roberts and handed him a single folded piece of stationery. "I was given this," he said, "in confession. I cannot say by whom, but it might give you the ending you're looking for." Roberts read it once, twice, then again slower. The letter was brief. "I struck Harold. I didn't mean to kill him. He came at me with madness in his eyes. He said he'd make me the villain, that he'd make the whole town believe I had blood on my hands. I shoved him. He hit his head. I panicked, put him in the barrel and left. I wanted to burn the ledger, but I lost my nerve. I did not hate him. I pitied him, but I feared what he was capable of. There was no signature, no date, no fingerprint, but the writing, flowing cursive with precise slant, looked like Earl Penny Driscoll. Father Bishop said the note was slipped under his office door, likely the night after Driscoll's formal arraignment. With this note added to Albie Morse's statement and the ledger evidence, the district court prepared for trial. The trial: guilt, community, and complications. Driscoll was charged with second-degree murder, not premeditated, but driven by confrontation and reckless action. His defense team argued that Kinnick was unstable and had staged multiple emotional episodes in recent weeks, pointing to the tin can letter and the private notes Mabel turned in. They implied that Kinnick had been spiraling, that Driscoll had acted defensively. The prosecution countered with Albie's eyewitness statement, the erased ledger entry, and the confession-like letter delivered to the church. What the jury saw was murky. The killing seemed unintentional, but the cover-up undeniable. Hiding the body, altering the ledger, lying to the sheriff, these weren't the acts of a remorseful man. After a week of testimony and nearly a full day of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of manslaughter. Driscoll was sentenced to 7 years in prison, eligible for parole in 3. It wasn't the verdict everyone wanted. Some felt it too harsh, others too lenient. But for the sheriff, it represented a kind of imperfect justice. As he told reporters outside the courthouse, this wasn't a murder of greed. It wasn't a killing born from hatred. It was 2 men caught in the quiet violence of debt and shame, the kind that festers between seasons and chokes people slowly. Driscoll served only 28 months before being released for good behavior. He never returned to Hollow Creek. He moved to Kansas City, where he lived out his remaining years working as a clerk in a hardware warehouse. And the Kinnicks. Mabel Kinnick stayed in Hollow Creek. She never remarried. Her daughters grew up and moved east. Some say Mabel kept the tin can and the 3 letters in a locked drawer until the day she died. Others say she burned them in the stove the night of the verdict. but no one could deny that the murder and everything around it changed the town. The general store was sold and renamed. The butcher shop moved across town. Father Bishop died 2 years later, and the new priest refused to speak about old ghosts. Even Sheriff Roberts retired the following spring. When interviewed for the Topeka Tribune shortly before his retirement, he reflected on the case with unexpected softness. We think of murder as rage or robbery, but in Hollow Creek it came on quiet feet. It grew slowly like mildew in a corner. Debt becomes guilt. Guilt becomes shame. Shame becomes desperation. And sometimes in the smallest towns, that's all it takes. He paused before adding, "Some crimes are loud. Some crimes whisper. This one whispered until it drowned a man." Legacy and lessons. Today, Hollow Creek is barely marked on modern maps. Most of the old buildings are gone. The store is a post office now. The butcher's yard was paved over for a parking lot. The rain barrel, long gone. But the story survives in archives, in whispers, and in a single surviving copy of the store ledger now housed in a Kansas historical collection. On page 47, there's a faint mark, an indentation, where Harold Kinnick $47.38 used to be. Nothing else is written on that line. Just a blank space. Where debt once lived, where suspicion grew, where a man's life ended and a community's trust in itself began to fray. Story 4, The Pigeon Drop, Old Scams That Ruined New Fortunes. You've likely walked past someone in an airport, or on a city street, or maybe in the parking lot of a grocery store, and heard them say something like, "Excuse me, I just found this envelope. Did you drop it?" Most people caught off guard say no and walk away. But some stop. They get curious. They lean in. And when they do, they enter a psychological trap so old, so elegant, and so perfectly engineered for human nature that it's been documented in scams dating back to the 1800s. It's called the pigeon drop, a con so successful that it not only survived for over a century, but in the 1940s and 50s, actually drove some victims to ruin, and in one case, suicide. It didn't use guns. It didn't rely on violence. It needed only a found wallet and a well-dressed stranger with a practiced script. This is the story of how one small group of con artists used this scam to strip dozens of elderly people, veterans, and shopkeepers of their savings across the American Midwest in the late 1940s, and how the FBI couldn't stop them for almost 5 years. The setup: kindness, curiosity, and confidence. The classic pigeon drop begins with two strangers, the grifter and the mark. The grifter, usually an older, well-dressed man or woman, pretends to find a wallet, envelope, or bag filled with cash. They approach the mark, the intended victim, and ask, "Did you drop this?" When the mark says no, the grifter pretends to open it. They act surprised. They show the money. Then, and this is the critical part, a second grifter known as the shill arrives. The shill plays along, acting equally surprised. They suggest turning the money in or splitting it. They raise ethical questions. And eventually, the group decides that in order to prove no one is stealing, each person should put up some collateral, maybe $500 or $1,000, just as a show of good faith, until they return to the bank together. Only, of course, once the mark hands over the money, the grifters vanish. It's a con that counts on people's fear of being dishonest and their desire to not look greedy. And in the 1940s, in the age of post-war prosperity and tightening social norms, it thrived. The man called Sully. The FBI's earliest records of organized pigeon drop operations date to 1946, when a man using the alias James Sullivan, or Sully, was reported in Des Moines, Iowa, after a local teacher lost $1,200, her entire retirement fund, to a scam involving a dropped purse and two polite men in church suits. Sully was said to be charming, never raised his voice, and spoke with a Midwestern accent, possibly from Missouri or Kansas. He wore cufflinks, carried a clean handkerchief, and drove a beige 1938 Buick with out-of-state plates. By the time the Des Moines police began investigating, Sully had already struck in Omaha, Lincoln, Topeka, Wichita, and several smaller towns. His victims followed a clear pattern. Elderly widows who handled their own finances, traveling salesmen with cash-heavy briefcases, small business owners just after bank withdrawals. What made Sully's version of the pigeon drop so devastating wasn't just the theft, it was the psychological aftermath. Victims felt complicit. They hadn't just been robbed, they'd been tricked into participating in what they thought might have been a shady deal. One man, a 67-year-old retired postmaster in Council Bluffs, told investigators, "It wasn't the money. It was that I thought I was smarter than this, that I let myself believe, just for a second, that I could walk away with something I didn't earn." He never got over the shame. He stopped attending church, sold his home, moved away. He wasn't alone. By 1947, the FBI believed Sully's crew had taken over $140,000 in under 18 months, nearly $2 million today, without ever pulling a weapon or writing a single bad check. Why it worked so well? The pigeon drop worked because it preyed on a mix of emotions. Greed, the idea of walking away with money found on the street. Guilt, fear of being thought a thief if they did show good faith. Trust, grifters dressed well, spoke politely, used names like Mr. Jeffries or Mrs. Templeton. Social pressure, the shill's presence created a group dynamic that made people less likely to object. Sully, experts believed, understood human behavior better than most therapists. One retired con man, interviewed decades later, said, "The thing about a pigeon drop is that it's not about money. It's about creating a moment so uncomfortable, so impossible to exit, that the mark has to do something, and the easiest thing is to go along." The downfall begins. It wasn't a detective or agent who first cracked the case. It was a 19-year-old woman named Helen Kraft, who worked at a hotel front desk in Wichita. Helen noticed that 3 different guests, all staying a day apart, paid in crisp $50 bills, and all of them used the same emergency contact address in their guest paperwork, a P.O. box in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She got curious. When one of the men, a clean-cut gentleman calling himself Mr. Sullivan, left his newspaper on the counter, Helen peeked at the margin. A scribbled note read, "Pick up at Grafton by noon, widow, trust fund, no kids." She copied it and mailed it to the local police chief. That note made its way to the FBI, and the agency, now seeing real patterns across state lines, opened Interstate Fraud Case 48721, the Sullivan Confidence Ring. Surveillance but no arrests. What followed was months of surveillance. FBI agents followed men they believed to be part of the ring across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri, but they never caught anyone in the act. The pigeon drop, by nature, was fast. A grift rarely lasted more than 10 minutes. By the time the mark realized they'd been had, sometimes hours later, the grifters were already crossing state lines. Agents would later say Sully was a ghost in a gray suit, always courteous, always controlled. They eventually arrested a man named David P. Mallow, believed to be one of Sully's top shills. But Mallow refused to talk. No names, no descriptions, nothing. He served 14 months for fraud and vanished after release. The suicide that changed everything. In 1949, a 62-year-old war widow named Beatrice Helm in Springfield, Missouri, fell victim to Sully's scam. She lost $3,800, her life savings, which she had withdrawn just 2 days prior to buy a home. Her neighbor found her body 3 days later, a suicide note pinned to the kitchen table. "I was a fool. I wanted to believe in something good. I believed in strangers, and now I am empty." The press exploded. Public anger surged, and for the first time, the FBI labeled the pigeon drop a national confidence racket of escalating threat. But despite the outrage, Sully was never found. His last known location, a boarding house in St. Louis, he left behind a jacket, a clean razor, and a list of names, all women, none of whom were ever found. Patterns in the footsteps. By 1950, nearly 4 years into the investigation, the FBI had compiled over 400 pages of internal memoranda, field notes, witness statements, and suspected sightings. They didn't yet have a confirmed photo of the man they believed to be Sully, but they had a pattern, and it was as consistent as it was maddening. He always stayed in modest but clean hotels, the kind with 2 front windows, flowered curtains, and clerks who never asked too many questions. He always used aliases that began with J. James Sullivan, Joseph Stanford, Jack Sefton, John Sellers. He always registered alone, and he always left before breakfast on the 3rd morning. The Bureau's behavioral specialists, a primitive version of what would one day become the Behavioral Analysis Unit, believed Sully wasn't just well-versed in con artistry. He was a student of human nature. In a memo dated February 12, 1950, Special Agent William L. Frakes wrote, "We are not chasing a thug. We are chasing a sociologist in disguise, a man who doesn't want to dominate people, he wants them to cooperate in their own undoing." This was the FBI's growing theory. Sully didn't rely on deception alone. He relied on consent. People walked into his trap willingly because he made them feel smart, valuable, chosen. This was, after all, the golden rule of the pigeon drop. Never push, only pull. The Bible scam twist. Just when the investigation seemed to stagnate, reports came in from rural Oklahoma and Arkansas of a new variant of the pigeon drop, one involving churches. In several towns, an elderly man in a fine suit would approach pastors after Sunday service. He claimed to have found a blessed purse on the property filled with cash, a rosary, and a worn Bible. He'd ask the pastor to help find its owner. Soon, a second man, the shill, would arrive, pretending to be the owner, but unwilling to accept the money unless he could give some back to the church. To ensure no theft occurred, the pastor would be asked to match the donation temporarily as a symbol of good faith. It was just the pigeon drop dressed in piety. In one case, a 73-year-old minister handed over $1,200 in church funds. He told the FBI afterward, "They didn't rob me, they seduced my ethics." It was this turn using the church that reignited the Bureau's interest at the highest levels. Sully had not only evaded capture, he was now adapting and involving religion. That made him a public menace, not just a con man. Enter Agent Marla Reyes. In May 1950, the FBI assigned Agent Marla Reyes, one of its few female field agents at the time, to go undercover as a vulnerable mark in Tulsa, one of Sully's frequent cities. Reyes was 34, sharp, composed, and had a background in behavioral psychology. Her job was simple: be seen cashing a large bank check, linger in predictable areas, and wait. After 11 days, she was approached by a man in a gray suit. He was tall, polite, carried a leather briefcase, and wore wire-rimmed glasses. He smiled with his whole face, not wide, just enough. He said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I believe you may have dropped this envelope." Reyes played along, her wire recording every word. The man suggested turning in the envelope, then said, "It would be wrong to keep it, wouldn't it?" Soon, a second man appeared, older, balding, dressed like a bank clerk. Reyes recognized the dynamic immediately. The con had begun. But she wasn't allowed to arrest them. Her job was to follow. After they vanished into a side alley, she tailed them to a boarding house registered under the name Joseph S. Langford. By the time the local police arrived, the room was empty, beds made, air still warm. But inside the trash, agents found three things: a torn page from a Gideon Bible, a matchbook from a diner in Springfield, Missouri, a photograph of a young woman with Helen K. written on the back. It was Helen Kraft, the hotel clerk from Wichita, who had first reported Sully's notes 3 years earlier. Did he know she was watching? The photo disturbed investigators. It suggested something none of them had considered, that Sully was aware of who had tipped off the FBI years earlier. But how? Had he returned to Wichita to watch her? Had he befriended her without her knowing? Helen, now working in Kansas City, was placed under protective watch for 3 months. She reported no unusual behavior, but she did receive 2 anonymous birthday cards that year. One had no return address, just the phrase, "Kindness is the finest disguise of all." A lasting impact. The FBI never captured Sully. By 1952, the string of pigeon drops tapered off. Either he retired, changed his methods, or died. No one knows. But what his scams left behind was something more enduring than stolen money. He left behind suspicion. Suddenly, people became wary of found wallets, helpful strangers, kind offers. A 1953 PSA, aired on national radio, warned listeners: if someone asks you to prove your honesty with your wallet, walk away. Don't be a pigeon. The phrase, "don't be a pigeon," entered the cultural lexicon shorthand for "don't be gullible." Meanwhile, the Bureau quietly published internal training documents using Sully's methods as a case study in psychological manipulation documents that would go on to influence how the FBI approached white-collar crime and social engineering for decades. The envelope that reappeared. In 1971, a woman in Kansas City cleaning out her late father's belongings found an envelope sealed with wax. Inside was $5 in 1950s currency, a rosary, and a note. "You didn't fall for it. That means something. Keep your kindness. Guard your doubt. J.S." The woman never found out who left it, but the handwriting, according to handwriting analysts, it matched Sully's last known note. He was still alive, or had, at least, left his legacy somewhere behind. How a scam becomes a blueprint. The pigeon drop was never the kind of crime that inspired headlines drenched in blood or spectacle. It wasn't violent. It wasn't noisy. But it was devastating in its own way, a betrayal wrapped in politeness, a lie delivered with a smile. And Sully, whoever he really was, perfected it. In fact, the FBI's final internal report on the Sullivan confidence ring, filed in late 1953, didn't even classify it under organized crime. It was filed under confidence schemes, psychological patterns, a category the Bureau rarely used at the time. The truth is, they had almost no way to stop him. No fingerprints, no consistent identity, no weapons, just a rotation of names, quiet towns, and people who once scammed often refused to come forward. Because more than money was stolen. Dignity was taken, and dignity is not something people advertise when it's lost. The report listed a conservative total of 116 confirmed victims, but investigators believe the real number to be closer to 600 across at least 12 states. The total sum stolen, likely over $400,000, nearly $5 million today. And yet only one person, David Mallow, the shill arrested in 1949, ever served time, and only for 14 months. Everyone else, names in ledgers, ghosts in hallways, shadows at the edge of a park bench. The marks who did come forward. In later years, oral histories collected from Depression-era survivors and post-war families revealed just how widespread the psychological aftermath was. One farmer in Nebraska said he lost $1,000 to the pigeon drop in 1951. He never told his wife. He worked extra hours, sold 2 cows, and claimed the money had been used to pay off debts. He carried the secret until his death. A widow in Missouri said she thought she'd been targeted by the scam, but was too embarrassed to admit she'd nearly handed over her savings. She kept the money, but lost sleep for weeks not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. She told her daughter years later, "It wasn't the trick, it was the flattery. He made me feel like I mattered. I think I just wanted to be seen." And that's the part most people miss about these kinds of crimes. They don't always target greed. Sometimes they target loneliness, boredom, a small, aching need to feel involved even if only for a moment. The unfinished letters. Among the personal effects discovered in a closed FBI file box from the Kansas City field office was a manila envelope labeled Undelivered File 89 F13. Inside were 7 handwritten letters, all addressed to various Johns, Josephs, and Mr. Sullivans. Each letter was from a victim or someone who suspected they'd narrowly avoided being one. One letter from a Kansas schoolteacher read, "I've decided to forgive you. I don't know why. Maybe because you were the first person to look me in the eye that whole week. I cried for a day, but then I remembered something. I'm still here. And you, wherever you are, you must always keep running." None of the letters were ever mailed. The return addresses had faded. Some had no dates, just names and ink that had curled with age. They were kept maybe in hopes that one day, the man in the gray suit would be caught. But he was. Modern echoes. Today, the pigeon drop still exists, but it's changed form. It's become digital. You'll see it in phishing scams, in fake inheritance emails, in cryptocurrency, wallet recovery, services, and too-good-to-be-true investment deals. The names have changed. The tools are faster. But the con is the same. Still counting on trust, still feeding off flattery, still asking people to believe that something small and lucky has fallen into their lap, and all they need to do is prove their honesty. A 2020 study by the Federal Trade Commission found that the most common online scams still rely on compliance through confusion and guilt, exactly what Sully mastered 70 years earlier. One cybersecurity expert noted, "The pigeon drop wasn't just a scam. It was a template, a psychological blueprint for nearly every trust-based fraud that followed." The man who was never found. Who was Sully? Some believed he was a former psychology professor dismissed from a Midwestern college after a quiet scandal. Others speculated he was an ex-intelligence officer from the war, someone trained in deception and manipulation. Still others insisted he was just a con man born with charm and a lack of conscience. But no photo of him was ever confirmed. No real name, no next of kin, no grave. Just a legacy. In 1983, a retired agent named Howard Reed, one of the last living members of the original case, gave an interview for an unpublished memoir. In it, he said, "You know what makes Sully different from the others? He didn't want your money. Not really. That was just the toll. What he wanted was for you to play along, for you to say yes. And once you did, he owned you even after he walked away." Reed paused, then added, "That's the worst kind of thief, the one you remember fondly while you're weeping." The final message. In 1995, a safe deposit box in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was opened after 30 years of inactivity. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, yellowed and folded neatly. On it, in that same smooth cursive, was a final note. "To those I met, forgive me. To those I fooled, I never hated you. I only needed you to believe. And to the man still chasing me, stop. I've already disappeared." No money, no name, just a signature, JS. Story 5. The town that sold its jail cells twice. You may think a jail cell is something you only have to buy once. It's steel, bolted, heavy. It doesn't wear out quickly, doesn't go out of style. And in most towns across America, It's one of the few pieces of civic infrastructure that never changes even when budgets tighten and mayors rotate like chairs in a music hall. But in Daring, Texas, circa 1957, jail cells became the centerpiece of one of the strangest small-town scams ever recorded. This wasn't a prison break. It wasn't a case of wrongful arrest. It was far weirder. Daring, population 980, sold the same set of jail cells not once, but twice, and it took state auditors nearly 5 years to catch on. What followed was a bizarre tangle of small-town deception, double invoices, missing sheriffs, and one overambitious mayor who thought he could outsmart bureaucracy with handshakes and carbon paper. The town with too many ledgers. Daring was the kind of place where nothing much happened, which made it the perfect place for something strange to happen without anyone noticing. It was halfway between Amarillo and nowhere, perched on a dry piece of highway that served more cattle than people. The local industries included a cotton gin, a grain elevator, and not much else. But Daring had something most towns didn't: ambition. Mayor Charles Chick Stabler, a former hardware store owner with a deep love for government forms and a louder love for civic prestige, had been in office since 1952. He wasn't corrupt, at least not in the traditional sense. He was a booster, the kind of man who wanted his town to get noticed, who believed in progress, who thought a modern jail could bring in attention, funding, maybe even a county contract. So when the Texas Department of Corrections announced a grant initiative for improving rural jail facilities, Chick jumped at the chance. In 1955, Daring applied for and received $8,200 to replace its 2 outdated steel jail cells with more secure, state-standard units. They selected a small regional contractor, PanWest Fabrication, out of Lubbock. The new cells were ordered, delivered, and installed by March of 1956. Invoices were signed, the press took photos, the mayor cut a ribbon for jail cells. Everything seemed above board. Until a year later, when the same jail cells were sold to another town, 90 miles away. The sale that was. According to records uncovered in the 1961 state audit, Daring submitted a second application to the same Department of Corrections program, this time under a different classification: surplus material sale with reinvestment. In short, they claimed they had extra jail infrastructure that they had purchased out of pocket prior to state involvement, and were now transferring that older equipment to another town, Olton, Texas. The problem: it was the same exact jail cells. PanWest Fabrication only made one set, one invoice, one delivery, but Mayor Stabler had found a loophole. He produced a handwritten invoice for a prior, unofficial purchase of emergency holding cages dated 6 months before the real order and claimed these were the ones being sold. The paperwork was good, too good. Stabler forged the signatures of 2 long-retired town commissioners. He stamped the invoice with a Daring seal that hadn't been used since 1949. He even attached blurry photos from a different jail project from an entirely separate county. The scheme worked. Olton paid Daring $4,100, half the original cost, believing they were buying used, pre-state-funded jail cells. The kicker: the cells never moved. They stayed in Daring. Olton eventually received a different set repurposed from an abandoned sheriff's station in Hill County, but the paperwork listed Daring as the supplier. No one questioned it. Funds changed hands. Budgets were closed. And for a while, Chick Stabler believed he'd just made his town an extra $4,000 without lifting a single bolt. A sheriff with no keys. The first real sign of trouble didn't come from a whistleblower or an audit. It came from a prisoner. In 1958, a local drifter named Raymond Triggs was arrested for public drunkenness. Nothing serious. He was locked in one of the new cells overnight, same cells, same jail. The problem: The deputy on duty didn't have the right key. He called the mayor. Stabler arrived in his night clothes, fumbling with a ring of keys, and finally used a pair of bolt cutters to unlock the door. When asked about the missing key, Stabler shrugged and said, "Oh, those might have gone to Olton." It was a joke, but it raised eyebrows. One of those eyebrows belonged to a regional newspaper reporter who happened to be at the station, picking up a friend arrested for reckless driving. He made a note. 2 months later, that note became a story. Jail mystery in Daring, 1 cell, 2 towns. The investigation begins. At first, no one took the story seriously. It read like a fluff-piece small-town mystery, bureaucratic quirk. But someone at the state controller's office saw the headline, matched it to 2 separate grant files, and realized Daring had been paid twice for the same equipment. An investigation was launched. Inspectors visited both Daring and Olton. The cells in Daring were accounted for. The cells in Olton, technically functional but completely different, a different manufacturer, different lock mechanism, different model. The audit uncovered the forged invoice, the reused photos, and the missing keys. Mayor Stabler was interviewed in late 1960. He admitted to a little paperwork smoothing, but denied fraud. "I just wanted to help another town out," he said. "We had extras in principle." That phrase would haunt him, in principle. Consequences and confusion. The state pressed charges for fraudulent misappropriation of grant funds, but the case never made it to trial. Chick Stabler suffered a stroke in early 1961 and was deemed unfit to stand trial. The town of Daring was required to repay the full $8,200 to the state aid debt that took nearly 8 years to settle through bond levies and emergency funds. Olton, ironically, kept their cells even though they were never actually from Daring. No one ever sued them. PanWest Fabrication went out of business in 1959, never knowing they'd been the center of a scam. The jail cells in Daring, still in place as of 1973 when the last report on the town's facilities was filed, rusting, unused, sitting beneath a plaque that still read, "Dedicated to Public Safety, 1956. Daring Paper Jail." After the scandal broke in 1961, Daring, Texas found itself the subject of jokes in state newspapers and small-town editorials alike. The Amarillo Chronicle ran a headline, "Town has bars but no prisoners or receipts." The Dallas Morning News editorial board wrote, "When your infrastructure is held together by staples and a handshake, expect things to get creative." The town became a Punchline A reputation that stuck, and one that masked something far more unsettling than misfiled invoices. No one really knew who was in charge anymore. Mayor Chick Stabler, incapacitated by his stroke, remained in name only. The town council, consisting of 3 members, one of whom was Stabler's cousin, quietly stalled appointments for months, hopping to avoid further scrutiny. The sheriff, that's where things got stranger. Sheriff Tilden's disappearing act. Technically, Sheriff E. Tilden had been Daring's lawman since 1949. A former ranch hand turned peace officer, Tilden had a reputation for being present enough, but not particularly active. Most days, locals said, you could find him playing dominoes at the diner or walking his dog along the tracks. But when state investigators began showing up in 1961 to trace the original jail cell installation, Tilden vanished. Not formally, his name was still on the books, but he stopped showing up. Calls went unanswered. Deputy logs went unsigned. The jailhouse desk sat empty for weeks. Rumors flew. Some said he'd taken early retirement and left town quietly. Others claimed he was staying with a cousin in New Mexico. A few believed he never existed in the first place. That last theory, while dramatic, wasn't entirely unfounded. When the state attorney general's office requested payroll records from Daring for Tilden's position, they found 6 years worth of paychecks issued but no signed deposit slips. The checks had allegedly been picked up in cash by an authorized courier. That courier, Mayor Chick Stabler. The implication was clear. Tilden may have been a real person once, but for the last several years, he was a name on paper A salary line that may have helped Stabler fund his budget gaps. No one ever confirmed what happened to Tilden. He was never seen again. A jail with no guards. By mid-1962, Daring had a functioning jail building complete with the infamous cells, but no one to operate it. So they improvised. The town council appointed Eula Me Dunbar, the town librarian, as temporary detention clerk. Her job was to log any overnight bookings and coordinate with the nearby county office if a real arrest needed to happen. In practice, this meant Eula Me kept the jail keys in her knitting bag, and if someone was drunk and disorderly, she'd call his wife to come get him. She did this unpaid for 6 months. Local teenagers started calling the jail Miss Dunbar's guest room, the second cell or the third. Despite the fallout, whispers began in late 1962 that Daring had attempted another equipment transfer, this time to a town named Madison Creek, another struggling outpost looking to modernize its lockup. No one could prove it, not yet. But here what happened. A line item appeared in Madison Creek's budget. Holding cell, upgrade $2,400. The listed supplier, Daring Municipal Salvage. There was no registered business in Texas under that name. The address traced back to Eula Me Dunbar's home. When questioned, Eula Me admitted that she had used the jail cells as collateral for a town equipment trade, exchanging them on paper for used typewriters, shelves, and a set of metal cabinets for the library. Her justification: they weren't being used. I figured, why not get something the town could actually use? No money changed hands, but the Department of Corrections flagged the maneuver anyway. For the second time in under a decade, Daring was accused of attempting to monetize jail property that had never been cleared for resale. The audit that shook the town. In 1963, the Texas State Auditor's Office performed what it called a complete forensic reconciliation of Daring's municipal records from 1952 to 1962. What they found was a staggering mix of duplicated forms, ghost employees, and at least 3 separate ledgers for town spending, each maintained by a different official. Among the strangest discoveries, a $900 holding cell ventilation system that had never existed. The room had one window. A contract with a company called TechSecure Facilities, which turned out to be a PO box in Fort Worth used by Stabler's nephew. A 1957 grant request for riot-proof shackles, despite the town having 0 incidents of civil unrest in recorded history. When asked for comment during the audit, Councilman Joel Franks famously said, "I think we got caught trying to be clever in a dumb kind of way." No charges, but plenty of shame. Despite ample evidence of deception, no criminal charges were filed. Why? Because nearly every act was done on paper, with forms that, while misleading, didn't technically violate the language of the grant laws at the time. Stabler, now wheelchair-bound and barely coherent, was declared unable to participate in legal defense. The town of Daring was placed under temporary state oversight, which lasted until 1966. The cells still in the jail, unused, untouched, but now affixed with a brass plaque reading, "Property of the people, not for resale." A quiet nod to a town that learned, the hard way, that you can't build legitimacy with receipts forged in the dark. A town that got too creative. By 1965, Daring, Texas had become more than just a town with a jail cell scandal, it had become a case study. Universities taught the Daring case in courses on public administration and municipal ethics. Auditing firms used it to train new hires on multi-ledger fraud indicators. Even the Texas Department of Corrections created a checklist called Daring Red Flags, warning rural townships about the dangers of invisible infrastructure budgeting. But for the people of Daring, the scandal wasn't abstract. It was humiliating. Local businesses suffered. State funding dried up. Journalists passed through for years afterward, snapping photos of the crumbling jailhouse like tourists at a ruin. And in the middle of it all sat a building no one dared touch, the jailhouse. A perfectly functional but now politically radioactive structure with jail cells at its center that symbolized everything the town wanted to forget. What happened to the jail cells? In 1967, after years of disuse, the Daring Town Council voted to convert the jail building into a record storage annex for city files. But even that became a controversy. Why? Because state law required a formal asset disposal or repurposing declaration for any equipment purchased with correctional grant funds. And Daring, already on thin ice, was afraid of triggering another audit. So they left the cells intact. They moved filing cabinets around them. They ran extension cords through the bars. One long-serving clerk, in a 1984 interview, described it this way. It was like working in a haunted museum. You'd file a birth certificate next to an iron cot, or update tax rolls while staring at a door with no key. No one was ever jailed there again. Not because the cells weren't usable, but because trust in the jail was gone, and trust, once broken by fraud, is harder to rebuild than concrete. The long shadow of Mayor Chick Stabler. Chick Stabler passed away in 1969, quietly, in a long-term care home 2 counties away. His obituary, printed in the local paper, made no mention of the scandal. Instead, it read, Charles E. Stabler served his town with vision and determination during a time of great change. And that was the final word. No posthumous investigation, no accountability from the family, just silence. But among the private notes of a former state auditor was this line. If he hadn't tried to sell the same jail cell twice, he could have been governor. That might sound ridiculous, but Stabler had charisma. He had vision. He believed in doing what works, even when it didn't quite follow the rules. It's what made him both a beloved figure in Daring and the architect of its most absurd betrayal. The state's quiet admission. The state of Texas never fully admitted its own part in the mess. After all, they approved the grants, failed to inspect the materials, and let nearly a decade pass before catching the deception. In a rare internal memo discovered decades later, a corrections officer admitted. The Daring case exposed the limits of trust-based rural funding. We asked for honesty and got invention. The lesson stuck. By 1970, new rural funding laws were passed requiring third-party inspections for every piece of grant-funded equipment, mandatory photo, documentation of installations, annual reporting on operational status, verified by county officers. These reforms were quietly nicknamed Daring Clauses. So in an odd way, the town's greatest embarrassment changed the way Texas handled small-town infrastructure. A jail cell no longer just meant steel bars and concrete. It now meant paper trails, proof, and transparency. What became of the jailhouse? The building still exists barely. As of a 2002 preservation inventory, the Daring jailhouse was listed as a non-functional historical structure, significant for administrative scandal, not criminal justice history. No one ever suggested turning it into a museum. No one proposed tour. Too many people still remembered. An archivist for the Texas Historical Commission once visited and noted the eerie atmosphere. It's a jail that never held prisoners, a building filled with consequences instead of convicts. The cells still there, rusting quiet, doors open. A monument not to law and order, but to how far people will go when ambition outpaces accountability. Final reflection: the cost of a lie. In the end, the jail cells in Daring weren't valuable because they held criminals. They were valuable because they represented something the town desperately wanted: legitimacy, progress, and recognition. Mayor Stabler didn't set out to defraud the state. Not exactly. He just believed that good intentions could excuse creative accounting, that if the town looked modern, it would become modern. But the damage done by dishonesty, especially when wrapped in bureaucratic language, has a way of outliving everyone involved. Today, Daring is mostly forgotten. No tourists, no museums, no footnotes in travel guides. Just a steel door that never closed on a prisoner, but locked an entire town in place. Story 6. The bookstore that laundered loyalty cards. You wouldn't think of a used bookstore as a place where money disappears. There are no fast cars, no diamond-studded villains, just old carpet, the scent of paper and coffee, and that silence only found between bookshelves. But in Canton, Ohio, in the early 2000s, one independent shop, Harbor Light Books, became the center of a bizarre financial scheme that lasted 8 years, involved tens of thousands of dollars, and was, for a long time, disguised as nothing more than a loyalty program. There were no counterfeit bills, no offshore accounts, just reward stamps, frequent buyer cards, and a clever trio who figured out how to turn store credit into real cash quietly. It's a story of nostalgia, accounting blind spots, and how small crimes, when unnoticed, can become strangely literary. Harbor Light Books, where stories lingered. At first glance, Harbor Light Books looked like any other second-hand shop on Main Street. Nestled between a boutique yarn store and a shuttered bakery, its windows were filled with yellowing hardbacks, handwritten staff pics, and a chalkboard that listed author birthdays. Run by Margaret Maggie Duell, a former librarian and lifelong bookseller, the store had a reputation for two things: an obsessive attention to categorization, a customer loyalty program that was too generous to be real. Every $10 spent earned you a stamp. Every 10 stamps earned a $10 credit. Regulars would often joke that you get more back than you spend. And oddly enough, they weren't wrong. What no one realized was that the program had become the perfect front for laundering cash. The staff behind the scheme. The core of the operation were 3 employees, each with very different skill sets. Maggie Duell, the owner, meticulous, principled, and known for saying, "Books are currency, just not the kind the IRS respects." Leo Garvin, store manager, a former accountant turned poet with a gift for software shortcuts. Darla Meeks, part-time cashier, quiet, observant, and fiercely loyal to Maggie, who had once helped her avoid eviction. It's unclear who initiated the scheme. What's clear is that by 2003, Leo had modified the store's point-of-sale system to allow the manual entry of phantom purchases, small transactions that never happened, but triggered reward stamps. For example, a non-existent sale of $10 would earn a stamp. After 10 such entries, a card would be marked redeemed. The reward credit could then be converted to real cash in the drawer, either by issuing refunds, buying inventory at fake prices, or issuing store checks. Because the purchases never happened, the store was never out inventory. But the system showed lots of customer activity, which Maggie loved. Loyalty cards as currency. The trick wasn't just about faking transactions, it was about creating fake customers. Leo and Darla maintained binders full of fake loyalty cards, each attached to fabricated customer names. J. Ellery, Sue Dashiell, R. Chandler, Agatha W., Don Winslow, all real authors or slight misspellings thereon. It was an inside joke. Each fake card could earn credit. That credit could then be applied to small purchases of used books, which Darla would quietly ring up refund or move to the donated column. It was circular, elegant, invisible. And it worked. Over time, the fraud became self-sustaining. They'd generate phantom loyalty activity. Redeem the rewards. Use the redeemed credits to quietly bleed cash from the till. Record the losses as markdowns, charitable donations, or unclaimed credits. Over 8 years, it added up to more than $58,000. Why it worked for so long? The simplicity of the scam is what made it brilliant and undetectable. Harbor Light Books was a cash-light, low-overhead business. Most books were donated or acquired for pennies. Margins were fuzzy. Customer records were handwritten or stored in a creaky access database. And Maggie Weil Sharp had no desire to micromanage. She trusted her staff implicitly. She once told a local reporter, "I believe in the honor system. The store runs on it, the customers support it. If someone gets a little extra, well, they needed it." It's unclear whether Maggie knew about the scam, or whether she saw signs and chose to look away. Some believe she found out and let it continue out of sympathy. Leo had medical debt. Darla was supporting 2 relatives. Others believe Maggie was completely in the dark. Either way, the fraud didn't stop because someone confessed. It stopped because the program became too successful. The audit trigger. In 2011, Harbor Light applied for a local heritage grant, which required a financial disclosure and limited audit. The program was part of a state initiative to support small historic businesses. When auditors reviewed the POS system, they were stunned by the loyalty activity. More than 1,800 cards issued in 8 years. Nearly $17,000 in rewards redeemed in the last 18 months alone. At least 300 active customers that had no contact information or purchase history. The math didn't work. Harbor Light was a 1,200 square foot store with 2 aisles and 3 employees. It could not possibly be generating the volume indicated. When auditors requested customer emails for the top 100 cardholders, Maggie flustered said, "We don't collect those. It's all trust." The audit triggered a deeper look, and within weeks the scheme began to unravel. The investigation begins. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, quietly opened a file on Harbor Light in March 2012. They conducted interviews with local customers, many of whom had no idea there even was a loyalty program. An examination of cash drawer variances. Some weeks showed $200+ in unexplained shortfalls. A subpoena of the store's point-of-sale software vendor, who confirmed manual entries had been used extensively and could be traced to Leo Garvin's admin account. Darla was interviewed first. She denied wrongdoing. Then, reluctantly, she handed over one of the loyalty card binders marked ARCHIVED. Inside were 150 cards. Nearly all had been redeemed at least once. All were tied to fictitious addresses or none at all. The secret ledger. When investigators subpoenaed the financial records from Harbor Light Books, they expected chaos. What they found instead was order, too much of it. Leo Garvin, despite his role in the fraud, had kept detailed internal logs of all activity, though none of it was officially reported in the store's accounting books. A second set of ledgers, stored on a password-protected USB drive hidden in a hollowed-out dictionary, titled The Rise and Fall of American Trust, offered a nearly perfect record of phantom purchases, redeemed loyalty cards, adjustments made to drawer tallies, weekly burn amounts, cash extracted and reclassified. Each entry included initials, LGDM or less frequently MD. The USB was found by accident when investigators seized Leo's desktop and peripherals and decided to catalog the entire bookshelf as evidence. A junior officer noticed the book felt too light and opened it to discover the thumb drive nestled inside. The ledger covered 2003 to late 2011 meticulously. It included notes, even justifications like $80 via A. Will's card, reclassified as donation, Maggie unaware. Closed week early for inventory. Ran J. Ellery through one last time before cleanup. Maggie asked about missing credit, played dumb, will adjust next month. There were even little quotes from books scribbled in the margins. One read, "The best hiding place is in plain sight. Just ask any good librarian." Paraphrased from The Name of the Rose. The effect was chilling and revealing. This wasn't an embezzlement done in desperation. It was curated, literary, measured, like someone writing a crime novel using real money. Maggie's role, the gray zone. When questioned by authorities, Maggie Duell, now in her early 60s, gave what investigators later described as the slipperiest deposition we've ever taken. She admitted she had known Leo was adjusting the loyalty program. She was aware some customer names weren't real. She believed it was done to keep the books balanced when inventory was missing or miscounted. She denied authorizing any cash withdrawals tied to phantom cards, being aware of fake refunds or burn weeks, participating in the falsification of POS records. "I ran a bookstore," she said, "not a hedge fund. I didn't know what Leo was doing with the drawer." That may have been true, but several entries in Leo's hidden ledger directly referenced Maggie, including one noting that she had approved the Dashiell overburn in October. When asked what that meant, Maggie responded, "It sounds like a soup recipe." The investigators weren't amused. Leo's confession. Confronted with the evidence, the USB, the fake cards, and Darla's partial testimony, Leo Garvin confessed. He was tired. "I only ever wanted to write poetry," he told the agents. "The numbers were just a way to stay warm in winter." He described the operation in remarkable detail, even correcting investigators when they mischaracterized how the phantom purchases were entered. "It was never about greed," he said. "It was about control. We weren't stealing. We were reshaping the economy of a dying bookstore." When asked why he kept such precise records, Leo responded, "Someone had to write it down. Otherwise, it's just theft. If it's recorded, it's history." It was, in its way, a literary defense of white-collar crime. Darla's dilemma. Darla Meeks, the soft-spoken cashier, became the emotional center of the story once it hit the media. She claimed she joined the scheme 2 years after it started reluctantly. She was a single caregiver for her mother and younger brother, and had taken the job at Harbor Light as a lifeline. "I didn't want to be involved," she told investigators. But Maggie said the loyalty cards were flexible, and Leo said it was just rearranging ink on paper. Eventually, she became complicit. She issued the refunds. She deposited the reward credits, and crucially, she began to spend the laundered cash. In her deposition, Darla broke down, not in anger or fear, but guilt. "I used fake bookstore money to buy real groceries. I cleaned floors with earnings from characters that didn't exist." The charges. In 2013, the state charged Leo Garvin with wire fraud, falsification of financial records, conspiracy to commit theft. Darla Meeks with accessory to fraud, tampering with public grant applications. Maggie Duell with negligent oversight, failure to report suspicious financial activity. Leo accepted a plea deal, 16 months in minimum security custody, and a 5-year prohibition from working in any retail or financial capacity. Darla, given her cooperation, received a suspended sentence, 300 hours of community service, and mandatory restitution payments totaling $4,000. Maggie was not criminally convicted, but she was barred from managing public funds or applying for grants on behalf of any business. The bookstore closed within a year. The public reacts. The case drew national attention not because of the money, but because of the tone of the fraud. It was a quiet, bookish crime, a theft committed in cursive. Readers wrote op-eds defending Maggie. Writers penned essays on the economic desperation of nostalgia. Bookstores across the country reevaluated their loyalty programs. One columnist for The New Yorker wrote, "They didn't steal because they were criminals. They stole because they loved the idea of keeping something small and magical alive, even if it meant bending every rule." But for the state, the case was clear. Good intentions don't excuse cooked books. And when phantom customers outnumber real ones, someone eventually notices the silence. After the pages closed, Harbor Light Books officially closed its doors in August 2014. There was no clearance sale, no farewell party, just a printed sign taped to the inside of the glass. "Thank you for the stories, M.D." Inside, the shelves sat half-stocked, dust gathering on old thrillers and forgotten self-help titles. The loyalty card display, once overflowing, was empty. Only a handful of regulars walked by in the following weeks, some trying the door, others just staring at the storefront. A few left notes. One simply read, "I always felt richer here than I ever was." The investigation had ended. The court cases were closed, but the ripple effects were only just beginning to make their way through small business circles, independent bookstore forums, and municipal grant offices across the country. Because this wasn't just a crime about loyalty cards. It was about what happens when a business becomes more fantasy than function. The mechanics of small deceits. One of the most confounding parts of the Harbor Light fraud was just how low risk it seemed. No one got rich, no lavish lifestyles, no suspicious purchases. Just a few $100s here and there, siphoned off under the guise of loyalty, refunds, and return policies. It was slow, boring, undetectable until someone looked very closely. Experts later described it as a death by 1,000 minor adjustments. What made the scheme dangerous wasn't its scope, it was its plausibility. Customers couldn't track their balances because the system didn't offer digital accounts. Staff had complete discretion to issue credit or rewards. No one questioned a drawer being $20 short. "Oh, we gave a discount," was explanation enough. All the trust that made a small bookstore charming made it vulnerable. The unseen toll. Investigators found no evidence of wealth accumulation. In fact, all three individuals lived modestly. Leo Garvin shared a duplex and still drove a 1996 Ford Taurus. Darla Meeks worked nights as a janitor even during the fraud. Maggie Duell took no salary some months, using her retirement to keep the lights on. So where did the money go? Mostly into the store. Into utility bills, used book acquisition lots, repairs to the building's failing HVAC, off-the-books payments to part-time help, donations to the local library's children's reading program. Ironically, the stolen money may have extended the store's life. As one state attorney put it, "It's the first time I've prosecuted a fraud ring that looked like it was trying to subsidize itself into bankruptcy." Leo's sentence and literary epilogue. Leo served 11 months of his 16-month sentence in a minimum security facility in Northeast Ohio. He spent most of his time cataloging the prison library and running a weekly writing group. Upon release, He moved to Michigan and under a pseudonym began publishing essays and poems about loss and integrity in small spaces. One poem, later identified as his, included the lines, "We built a cathedral out of coupons, stacked saints made of store credit. The roof collapsed in the silence between receipts." In a public interview given anonymously through a prison education nonprofit, he said, "I don't regret trying to save Harbor Light. I regret thinking that bending reality would make it more real." Darla's redemption. Darla completed her community service in less than a year. She worked at a local literacy nonprofit, helping children from low-income families learn to read. When her background came up, she didn't hide it. One parent recalled, she said, "I helped steal bookstore money once. Now I'm using it to buy your kid a dictionary. And I thought that's the kind of honesty I want around my child." Darla paid off her restitution in full by 2019. She was later hired as a school library aide. She reportedly keeps one loyalty card, the only real one she had ever used, in her wallet. It's worn, stamped 6 out of 10, and marked with her real name. And Maggie Duell moved in with her sister outside Columbus, where she took up gardening. She declined interviews, but occasionally sent letters to former customers and employees, most signed with quotes from classic novels. In one such letter, addressed to Darla and later published with permission, she wrote, "Perhaps our story was always fiction dressed as nonfiction, but we were sincere in our illusions, and that counts for something, doesn't it?" She never reopened a business, never wrote a memoir, never issued a formal apology. And yet, many in the town still remember her as the heart of Main Street. Legacy beyond the bookstore. The Harbor Light scandal became a cautionary tale not about greed, but about idealism with no guardrails. In the aftermath, small business organizations across Ohio began, requiring formal POS tracking for loyalty programs, advising against fully cash-based reward redemption, encouraging digital trails, customer IDs, and separation of duties in accounting, offering ethics training for sole proprietors. One merchant association referred to it as the loyalty card loophole and how not to fall into it. But for some, Harbor Light Books wasn't a scandal. It was a gentle fraud born of desperation and misplaced love for a vanishing way of life. And perhaps that's the hardest part, the part that makes this crime story linger. Final reflection: when rewards become ruin. In the end, the scheme didn't collapse because it was too big. It collapsed because it was too good, too smooth, too perfect. No one asked questions because it felt like magic, buying a book, getting a stamp, feeling valued. Until, of course, the math betrayed the charm. Harbor Light's loyalty program was supposed to reward reading. Instead, it revealed a deeper truth. When the system is built on sentiment, the first thing to break is trust. And once that goes, no stamp can ever bring it back.